The wedding of Mafia boss Dante Moretti was supposed to end with a kiss. Instead, it ended with a scream. As hundreds of guests watched in horror, a maid burst through the ballroom, grabbed the bride by her beautiful blonde hair, and slammed her face straight into the wedding cake. Security reached for their weapons. Dante's men surrounded her. Everyone thought the maid had lost her mind. But then she pointed at the cake, calm as anything, and said, "Don't let anyone eat it." The bride's face went completely pale. Seconds later, the maid looked directly at the most dangerous man in New York and said, "Your fiancé poisoned your wedding cake because you were never supposed to survive tonight." No one believed her, until the laboratory results came back. If you're new here, welcome to the family. Subscribe to Mr. Mafia Boss, because this is where the dangerous men live, the loyal ones fight back, and every story hits harder than the last. Now, let's find out exactly what Rosaline saw, and why she was willing to risk her life to make sure nobody touched that cake. The Moretti estate smelled like white roses and old money, and Rosaline Hart had polished every inch of silver in the ballroom twice, because Mrs. Falcone, the head of household staff, did not believe in leaving anything to chance on the day Dante Moretti got married. Rosaline believed in very little, as a rule. Not luck, not fate, not the idea that a man who ran half the East Coast's underworld deserved a wedding this beautiful. But she believed in doing her job well, and her job today was making sure 400 of New York's most dangerous people had a flawless afternoon. "Careful with that veil," Mrs. Falcone hissed, passing her in the hallway. "It costs more than your yearly salary." "Everything in this house costs more than my yearly salary," Rosaline muttered, straightening a candelabra that didn't need straightening, including the napkins. She'd taken the job 8 months ago, needing rent money and asking exactly 0 questions about the family she'd be serving, because in this line of work, questions got you fired, or worse. She'd learned to move through the Moretti estate like furniture, present, useful, and entirely beneath anyone's notice, which was exactly why nobody noticed her standing near the dessert table when the bride slipped away from her bridesmaids. Rosaline almost didn't notice either. She was refilling a tray of champagne flutes, half her attention on the string quartet warming up in the corner, when something about the bride's posture caught her eye. Too quick, too furtive, entirely wrong for a woman who was supposed to be floating through her own wedding day in a haze of joy. Vivian Cross was beautiful in the way marble statues were beautiful. Flawless, cold, built to be admired from a distance. She'd swept toward the towering 4-tier wedding cake alone, glancing over her shoulder once, twice, and Rosaline, who had spent her whole life noticing the things people hoped nobody would notice, went very still behind the champagne cart. Vivian reached into the folds of her wedding dress and withdrew a small glass vial. Rosaline's stomach dropped. The bride uncapped it with practiced, steady fingers. No hesitation, no fear, the movements of someone who'd rehearsed this, and poured a thin, colorless liquid along the base of the top tier, right where the knife would cut first. Then she recapped the vial, tucked it back into her dress, smoothed her skirt, and turned back toward her bridesmaids with a smile so perfect it made Rosaline's skin crawl. For a moment, Rosaline simply stood there, tray forgotten in her hands, trying to convince herself she'd imagined it. But she hadn't. She never imagined things. She noticed them, cataloged them, filed them away, a habit that had gotten her fired from 2 jobs for pointing out what everyone else pretended not to see. She set the tray down and moved. "Excuse me." She caught the arm of the nearest security guard, a broad man with an earpiece and 0 patience for interruptions. "I need to speak to someone now. It's about the cake." He looked at her the way men like him always looked at maids. Through her, past her, like she was part of the wallpaper that had briefly, inconveniently spoken. "Not now. I'm serious. I saw the bride put something in it. A liquid. Poison maybe. I don't know. But you need to stop the ceremony. Lady, if you don't get back to your station, I'll have you removed." "I'm telling you, move," he said. already turning away, already dismissing her, and Rosaline felt something cold and furious settle into her chest, because she recognized this particular flavor of being unheard. She'd spent her whole life being underestimated by people who mattered less than they thought they did. She looked around desperately. The wedding planner was arguing with a florist. Mrs. Falcone had vanished into the kitchen. The groom, Dante Moretti himself, tall and dark and terrifyingly still even from across the room, stood near the altar in quiet conversation with two men who looked like they'd killed people before breakfast. There was no one to tell, no time to explain herself to someone who'd actually listen. The music shifted. The ceremony was beginning. Rosaline's pulse hammered as she watched the wedding proceed with horrifying, unstoppable momentum. Vows exchanged, rings placed, the officiant's voice rising toward the pronouncement that would make Vivian Cross the untouchable wife of the most dangerous man in New York. Poison, already waiting in the cake, meant to be cut and shared with hundreds of guests the moment the ceremony ended. The cake was wheeled toward the center of the ballroom on its gleaming silver cart, 4 tiers high, purple roses cascading down white fondant, utterly beautiful and utterly lethal. Rosaline made a decision in the space of half a heartbeat, the kind of decision that would either save lives or end her own, and she genuinely didn't have time to weigh which was more likely. She crossed the ballroom at a dead run, ignoring the gasps, ignoring the hand that grabbed for her sleeve and missed, and reached the cake exactly as Vivian turned toward the crowd with the ceremonial knife already lifted. Rosaline grabbed her by the hair. The scream that came out of Vivian was pure, undiluted shock, and it barely registered over the sound of 400 guests gasping in unison as Rosaline slammed the bride's face straight into the top tier, into the exact spot laced with poison, frosting, and roses and colorless liquid smearing across Vivian's perfect features in one violent, unstoppable motion. The ballroom erupted. Security surged forward, but guns came up. Someone screamed for medics. Dante Moretti moved across that ballroom faster than a man his size had any right to move, and in seconds, Rosaline was surrounded, wrestled to her knees, a dozen weapons trained on a maid who'd just publicly humiliated the bride of New York's most feared mafia boss on her own wedding day. "Arrest her," Dante said, and his voice was terrifyingly calm, cold enough to freeze the whole room. Rosalind, pinned to the marble floor with a knee against her spine and a gun inches from her skull, found the only breath she had left and used it exactly right. "Test the cake," she shouted. "Test the damn cake before anyone eats it." They dragged her to a windowless room somewhere deep in the estate, the kind of room Rosaline suspected had seen worse than a hysterical maid before. Bare walls, a single steel chair, the distinct smell of bleach that meant someone had scrubbed this space clean recently and thoroughly. Dante Moretti entered alone 20 minutes later, still in his wedding suit, tie loosened, a muscle working steadily in his jaw. "You have exactly one chance to explain yourself," he said, "before I stop caring whether you're a maid or not." "I already told your security goon," Rosaline said, wrists zip-tied to the chair, chin lifted despite the fear crawling up her spine. "Your bride poured something into the cake. I watched her do it. I tried to tell someone, and your very competent staff decided a maid's word wasn't worth interrupting the ceremony." "My fiancée," Dante said, each word deliberate, "has been comforted by 3 separate members of my family since you attacked her in front of 400 guests. She says you approached her out of nowhere, unprovoked. Of course she says that. She has a bruise on her cheekbone and frosting in places frosting shouldn't be, thanks to you." "Better a bruise than poison in her bloodstream," Rosaline shot back, and something flickered across Dante's face. Not quite doubt, but a hesitation, quick and gone. "Careful," he said, low. "You're speaking about the woman I'm about to marry." "You already married her," Rosaline said. "I was standing right there. I just made sure nobody ate the cake before somebody smart enough to run a lab test got their hands on it." Dante's eyes narrowed, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, and pride that made her refuse to. "If you're lying," he said quietly, "there is nowhere on this earth quiet enough to hide from what happens to you." "If I'm lying," Rosaline said, "then test the cake and prove it. What are you so afraid of?" Something shifted behind his eyes, brief and unreadable, before the door opened and one of his men leaned in, face pale in a way that made the whole room go colder. "Boss," the man said, "lab results came back. There's poison in the cake, exactly where she said it would be." The silence that followed felt like the entire estate holding its breath. Dante turned back to Rosaline slowly, and for the first time since he'd walked into the room, she watched the absolute certainty drain out of his face, replaced by something far more dangerous, the look of a man realizing the ground beneath his entire world had just cracked open. "Postpone the wedding," he said finally, not looking away from Rosaline. "Indefinitely. And get me everyone who had access to that cake in the last hour. Boss, there's something else." The man hesitated, glancing at Rosaline, like he wasn't sure she should hear this part. "Someone tried to destroy the remaining samples 10 minutes ago. Whoever it was got to the kitchen before we could secure the evidence." Dante's jaw tightened, and Rosaline watched calculation replace shock in his expression, fast and cold. "Cut her loose," he said. The guard blinked. "Boss?" "I said cut her loose." Dante's eyes hadn't left Rosaline's face. "She's the only witness who saw it happen, and someone in this house just tried to bury the only proof that would confirm her story. That makes her the most valuable person in this building right now, not the most expendable." The zip ties came off, and Rosaline rubbed her wrists, watching Dante with wary, sharpening attention. "So I'm not under arrest," she said. "You're under my protection," Dante said, "which right now looks remarkably similar to being under arrest. So don't get comfortable." "Comforting? I don't do comforting." He crossed to the door, pausing with his hand on the frame, something unreadable in the set of his shoulders. "But someone in my house just tried to poison me on my own wedding day and then tried to erase the evidence within the hour, which means whoever did it moved fast, which means the poison went into that cake only minutes before the ceremony began." Rosaline felt the weight of that land, cold and clarifying. "That narrows down who could have done it." "Considerably," Dante agreed, and for the first time, something like respect flickered across his face as he looked at her. "Which means you're about to become very important to a lot of people who would rather you'd stayed quiet." By morning, the estate had transformed into something closer to a war room than a house in mourning for a ruined wedding. Dante's men moved through the halls with clipped, efficient purpose, and Rosaline found herself installed in a study she was fairly certain cost more to furnish than her entire childhood home, waiting to be interrogated for the second time in 12 hours. "Walk me through it again," Dante said, standing rather than sitting, arms crossed, looking like a man who hadn't slept and wasn't planning to anytime soon. Every detail, what she was wearing when she moved, what hand she used, how long it took. "I've told this story 3 times." "Tell it a 4th. Rosaline exhaled, long and slow, and recited it again. Vivienne's furtive glance, the vial, the pour, the recap, the smile that had made her skin crawl. Dante listened with the stillness of a man cataloging every word for inconsistency, and found none, because there weren't any. "You're certain it was her right hand," he said. "I'm certain," Rosaline said, "that you've asked me that exact question twice now, which tells me you're not actually testing my memory. You're testing whether I'll change my story to make it easier to believe I'm lying." Something flickered in his jaw. "That's not. It's exactly what you're doing," she said. "You want an inconsistency so you can stop having to consider that the woman you were about to marry poured poison into her own wedding cake. I get it. Nobody wants that to be true. But wanting it isn't the same as it not being true." "Careful," Dante said, low, the warning clear in his voice. "Or what?" Rosaline crossed her arms right back at him. "You'll interrogate me a 5th time? At this point, I could recite it in my sleep." Might as well start charging you for repeat performances. For a moment, something almost like surprise crossed his face. The expression of a man who was not used to being spoken to like this by anyone, let alone the maid he'd nearly had arrested the day before. "You don't seem particularly afraid of me," he observed. "Should I be? Most people are. Most people probably haven't spent 8 months watching you eat breakfast in silence every morning, like the world owes you an apology just for existing," Rosaline said. "You're intimidating, sure, but you're not currently the person trying to poison anyone in this house. That title belongs to someone with better manners and worse intentions." Dante actually huffed something that might, in a more generous mood, have been called a laugh. "You have a remarkable amount of nerve for someone who nearly got shot yesterday." "I have a remarkable amount of nerve for someone who saved your life yesterday," Rosaline corrected. "I'd think that earns me at least a little latitude on tone." He studied her for a long moment, and she watched something recalibrate behind his eyes. Not quite trust, not yet, but the beginning of something adjacent to it. "The investigation into who tampered with the evidence is stalled," he admitted, more openly than she suspected he'd intended. "Whoever destroyed the samples in the kitchen did it clean. No cameras in that hallway, no prints. That's convenient." "It's suspicious," Dante said, "which is different. Suspicious of who?" "That's what I'm trying to determine," he said. "And I'd get further if my chief investigator wasn't currently second-guessing every angle I bring to him, because he's too loyal to Vivian's family to consider she's guilty of anything." Rosaline tilted her head. "You think your own investigator is protecting her?" "I think," Dante said carefully, "that loyalty in this house runs in directions I haven't fully mapped yet, and until I do, I'm not trusting anyone with this case who has a personal stake in the outcome. Except me." "You have no stake in this at all," Dante said. "Which, unfortunately, makes you the most useful person in this building." Rosaline arched an eyebrow. "Careful, Mr. Moretti. That almost sounded like a compliment." "Don't get used to it." Before she could respond, one of his men knocked and entered without waiting for permission. A bad sign, Rosaline had already learned, since nobody interrupted Dante Moretti casually. "Boss, the kitchen assistant who prepped the cake decorations yesterday. She's not answering calls. Nobody's seen her since last night." Dante's expression went instantly, coldly still. "Find her. We're trying. Her apartment's empty. Neighbors say a car picked her up around midnight." Rosaline felt something cold settle low in her stomach. "That's not a coincidence." "No," Dante agreed, already moving toward the door. "It's a pattern. Someone's cleaning house, and they're moving faster than we are." The kitchen assistant's body was never found, but her absence told Rosaline everything the poison alone hadn't. That whoever had orchestrated this wasn't improvising. They were executing a plan with the kind of ruthless efficiency that made Rosaline's skin prickle every time she walked past a closed door in that house. She spent the next 2 days combing through the wedding day's timeline with Dante, cross-referencing staff schedules, kitchen access logs, security footage that conveniently glitched at exactly the wrong 3-minute window. And the more she dug, the more the story Vivian had told everyone began to fray at the edges. "She said she never left the bridal suite before the ceremony," Rosaline said, spreading the security logs across the study table. "But the footage from the east hallway shows a woman in a wedding dress passing the kitchen corridor 11 minutes before the cake was wheeled out." "That could be anyone in a wedding dress," Dante said, though the tightness in his voice suggested he didn't believe that any more than she did. "There was only one bride at this wedding, Dante." "Don't." His voice sharpened, the first real edge she'd heard from him in 2 days. "Don't say her name like she's already convicted." "I'm not saying anything," Rosaline said, quieter now, watching the strain pull tight across his face. "I'm reading you a timestamp. She loves me," Dante said, and it came out rougher than she suspected he'd meant. An admission wrestled loose against his will. "In 3 years, Rosaline. I don't make mistakes like this. I verify everything, I trust almost no one, and I let this woman into every corner of my life because I believed, completely, that she was exactly who she claimed to be. Maybe she was, Rosaline said. Once. People change. Or maybe you never actually knew her at all, and that's a harder thing to sit with than admitting you were wrong about a hallway camera. Dante didn't answer. Jaw tight, eyes fixed on the timestamp like it might rearrange itself into a story he could live with. They kept working past midnight, and it was somewhere around 1 in the morning, in the quiet hours when the estate had gone still, and even Dante's restless energy had settled into something heavier, that Rosaline noticed the smell. Faint, sweet, wrong. "Do you smell that?" she asked. Dante lifted his head, nostrils flaring, and went instantly rigid. "Get down." She didn't have time to ask why before he was moving, shoving the study table aside and pulling her down behind it as the window behind them shattered inward. Not gunfire, she realized a half-second too late, but something worse, a canister rolling across the floor, hissing, releasing a thin curl of pale gas into the room. "Don't breathe it in," Dante snapped, already hauling her toward the door, one arm locked hard around her waist. "Move. Now." They burst into the hallway coughing, lungs burning faintly even from the brief exposure, and Dante's men swarmed the corridor within seconds, weapons drawn, sweeping the grounds for whoever had thrown that canister through a second-story window with terrifying precision. They knew exactly which room, Rosaline gasped. Once they were clear, once the world had stopped tilting quite so violently. "Nobody outside your inner circle knew we were working in that study tonight." Dante's face had gone hard and cold, the earlier grief over Vivian buried under something far more immediate. Which means whoever did this has access to information only a handful of people should have. "Which means it's someone in this house," Rosaline said. "Someone close to you." "I know," Dante said, and for the first time since she'd met him, she heard something close to fear underneath the fury. Not fear for himself, she realized, but fear of exactly how deep this betrayal actually ran, and how close it had just come to costing her life instead of only threatening his. He looked at her then, really looked, something shifting behind his eyes that had nothing to do with investigations or evidence. "You could have died in there," he said quietly. "So could you." "I've had people try to kill me for 15 years, Dante said. "You've had it happen twice in 3 days, and both times it's because you told me the truth when everyone around me was lying." His jaw tightened. "That's on me, not you." "Careful, Mr. Moretti," Rosaline said, breath still unsteady, heart still hammering from more than just the gas. "That almost sounded like you actually care whether I live or die." Dante didn't answer with words. He answered by not stepping back, by staying close enough that she could feel the tension radiating off him, something complicated and unspoken settling into the space between them that neither of them was ready yet to name. The safe house Dante moved them to, after the gas attack, was smaller than the estate, tucked into a quiet residential block that looked, from the outside, like nothing more interesting than a lawyer's second home. Inside, it was reinforced steel behind plaster walls and cameras in every corner, the kind of place built by a man who'd learned, the hard way, that comfort and safety rarely lived in the same building. Rosaline had been given her own room, though she suspected given was generous. Assigned was closer to the truth, along with 2 guards who didn't leave the hallway outside her door. "I'm not going to run," she told Dante, the third morning, watching him pour coffee like the act of doing something normal might steady the rest of his unraveling world. "You know that, right? If I wanted to disappear, I'd have done it after the first assassination attempt, not stuck around for a second one." "It's not about you running," Dante said. "It's about someone finishing what they started." Comforting phrasing, as always. He almost smiled. Almost. It had started happening more often in the last 3 days. Small, involuntary cracks in the granite of him, quickly smoothed back over, before they could be examined too closely. They spent the morning going through documents his most trusted analyst had pulled together. Financial records, old surveillance photos, favors called in from people who owed Dante enough to answer questions quietly. Rosaline had never been particularly good at spreadsheets, but she was very good at noticing when something didn't fit a pattern, and by noon she'd found exactly that. "Look at this," she said, sliding a folder across the table. Vivienne's family background. Cross-import and textiles. Legitimate business. Been in New York for 2 generations. I know her family's history. Do you know it? Or did she tell you it? Rosaline tapped the folder. Because according to this, cross-import and textiles didn't exist before 11 years ago. No tax filings before that. No business license. It just appears, fully formed, with an address that used to belong to a shell company registered in Chicago. Dante's expression shifted, slow and careful. The look of a man forcing himself to consider something he badly didn't want to be true. Chicago. You know that name, Rosaline said, watching him. The Castellano family ran Chicago's West Side for 30 years, Dante said quietly, until my father pushed them out during the territory wars, back before I took over. They lost everything. Vanished from the business entirely, or so we believed. Or so you were meant to believe. Dante sat back, rubbing a hand over his jaw, something dark and unsettled moving behind his eyes. Vivienne told me her father built that business from nothing, that he'd always been legitimate, that it was one of the things that first drew me to her, a woman untouched by this world, who understood it without being part of it. Or a woman raised specifically to seem untouched by it, Rosaline said, gently now, watching the theory land somewhere it clearly hurt. Dante, if her father is Castellano, rebuilt under a new name, this isn't a coincidence. This is a plan, and it's been running for at least 11 years. That's not proof, Dante said, though his voice had lost its conviction. No, Rosaline agreed, but it's a thread, and threads unravel things, if you pull hard enough. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the folder like it might rearrange itself into something less devastating. 3 years, he said finally, low. I let this woman into every room in my life. I told her things I've never told another living person. If she's been building toward something this whole time, then it's not a reflection on you, Rosaline said. It's a reflection on how good she is at this. Those aren't the same thing, and you need to stop treating them like they are. Dante looked at her, something unguarded in his face that she hadn't seen from him before. Not the mafia boss, not the man giving orders, just a person absorbing a betrayal too large to process all at once. Why does it matter to you, he asked quietly, whether I blame myself or not? Rosaline hesitated, surprised by the question, surprised more by how much she wanted to answer it honestly. Because you've spent 3 days treating every piece of evidence like a personal failure instead of information, she said. And I need you thinking clearly, not drowning in guilt, because whoever's behind this isn't finished. She proved that with a canister through a window. That's the only reason? Something in his tone made her pulse skip, made the air in the room shift into something warmer, more dangerous than investigation notes and financial records. Ask me again, Rosaline said, quiet, when we're not both currently hiding from an assassin. Dante studied her for a long moment, something almost like a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth despite everything. Noted, he said, for later. The message arrived that evening, forwarded from one of Dante's contacts inside the district attorney's cybercrime unit. A favor called in quietly, off the books, the kind of thing that could get someone fired if it ever surfaced officially. Encrypted messages, recovered from a burner phone linked to Vivienne's personal assistant. Dante read them in silence at the kitchen table, jaw tightening with every line, while Rosaline watched his face go through something that looked almost like grief. Read it, he said finally, sliding the tablet across to her. The messages were clinical, businesslike, utterly chilling in their detachment. Package secured for the ceremony, dosage calculated for survivable exposure only. Confirm rival family placement before extraction begins. Survivable exposure, Rosaline read aloud, frowning. That doesn't make sense. If she poisoned the cake to kill you, maybe that's not what it was for, Dante said slowly, the pieces shifting behind his eyes, even as he said it. What do you mean? What if I was never the target, he said. What if she poisoned herself? A careful, survivable dose, timed to look like an attack, positioned to make it seem like someone tried to assassinate the bride at her own wedding. Rosaline's stomach dropped as the shape of it clicked into place. She'd become the victim. The whole underworld would believe someone tried to kill Dante Moretti's bride on her wedding day. And I'd go to war, Dante said, the words coming slower now, heavier, against whoever she pointed me toward. Rival families. Anyone standing between her father and control of every territory he lost 11 years ago. You'd have burned half of New York's underworld to the ground, Rosaline said quietly, avenging an attack that never actually happened, while she and her father picked up whatever pieces were left. Dante sat back, and for the first time since Rosaline had met him, she watched the full weight of the last 3 years settle across his shoulders. Not just betrayal, but the slow, sickening realization of how close he'd come to becoming exactly the weapon Vivian had built him to be. I would have done it, he said, quiet, hollow. Without question, she could have named any family, and I would have gone to war for her within the hour. But you didn't, Rosaline said, because I ruined the cake before she could finish the performance. Something shifted in his expression. Gratitude, maybe, tangled up with something rawer underneath it. Before he could answer, the door opened without a knock, and Dante's second-in-command entered, face carefully blank in the way Rosaline had learned meant very bad news. Boss, Vivian wants to see you. She's requesting a private meeting. Says she can explain everything, if you'll just hear her out alone. Dante's jaw tightened. Alone. Her exact words. Rosaline watched him weigh it. Watched 3 years of love war visibly against everything the last 3 days had proven, and felt something cold slide into her chest at the uncertainty still lingering in his eyes. Don't, she said quietly. Whatever she says, it'll be constructed to make you doubt every piece of evidence we've found. That's what she does. She's good at being believed. I have to hear it, Dante said. If there's any explanation. There isn't, Rosaline said, sharper now, frustration cracking through. Dante, she planned a survivable poisoning to start a war in your name. That's not a misunderstanding you talk through over tea. I need to hear it from her, he said, and something in his voice had gone distant, torn between the man who trusted evidence and the man who'd loved this woman for 3 years. I owe her that much. You don't owe her anything. Rosaline, his voice was quiet, final. I need to do this. She watched him go, watched the door close behind him, and felt a cold certainty settle low in her stomach, that whatever Vivian said behind that closed door, it would be crafted precisely to unravel everything they'd built over the last 3 days. She was right. He returned an hour later, face unreadable, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the warmth from that afternoon. She says you're lying, he said, that you've fabricated evidence to frame her because you resent her position, because you've wanted access to this family's money and protection since the day you started working here. Rosaline felt the floor tilt beneath her. You can't actually believe that. I don't know what to believe anymore, Dante said, and the distance in his voice was worse than anger would have been. Everyone in this has a story, Rosaline. Yours has been consistent. So has hers. I need proof that can't be explained away by either side. And until I have it, until you have it, what? Her voice rose despite herself, hurt bleeding through faster than she could stop it. You're going to hand me back to security? Let her finish what she started? I need space to think, Dante said. Away from both of you. Rosaline stared at him, chest tight, 3 days of trust cracking under the weight of a single closed-door conversation, and felt something in her harden into resolve. Fine, she said quietly. Think. But while you're doing that, Someone's going to come finish the job Vivienne started. And I'm not going to sit here and wait to find out if you've decided I'm disposable before or after it happens." She left before he could answer, out into a night that suddenly felt far more dangerous alone than it ever had beside him. Rosaline made it 4 blocks before the car found her. Not Dante's car. She knew the shape of his security fleet by now, the particular black of the SUVs his men favored. This one was different. Sleek, foreign, the kind of vehicle that belonged to someone who valued speed over subtlety, and it pulled up alongside her on the empty street with a slowness that made every hair on her arms stand up. She ran. She didn't think, didn't calculate, just ran the way her body understood danger, long before her mind caught up to naming it, cutting through an alley too narrow for the car to follow, boots pounding against wet pavement, lungs burning in the cold night air. A man was waiting at the other end. She didn't see him until it was almost too late. A shape peeling off the shadows, hand already reaching for her arm, and she twisted hard enough to break his grip, drove her elbow back into something that made him grunt, and kept running, blood roaring in her ears, certain, with a cold clarity that cut through the panic, that this was exactly what Vivienne had wanted the moment Dante walked away from her. She didn't see the second car until headlights swung across the alley mouth ahead of her, blocking the only way out. She stopped, chest heaving, trapped between a stranger closing in from behind and a car she didn't recognize idling ahead, and for one terrible second she thought this was where it ended. A maid, alone, 3 days after saving a man's life, discarded exactly the way she'd feared. The car door opened. "Get in," Dante said. Relief hit her so hard her knees nearly buckled. "You." Explanations later. He was already out of the car, moving past her toward the man closing in from behind, and whatever happened next was fast and brutal and over before she'd fully processed it. The stranger down. Dante's knuckles split, his breathing controlled, despite the violence he'd just delivered with terrifying efficiency. "Get in the car," he said again, softer now, extending a hand toward her. She got in. They drove in silence for 10 minutes before either of them spoke, adrenaline still thick in the air between them, and it was Rosaline who broke it first, voice shaking with leftover fear and something closer to fury. "You told me to think you'd abandon me to prove a point. I never abandoned you." Dante's hands were tight on the wheel, jaw set. "I had you followed the second you walked out that door. I told you I needed space to think, and I did think, Rosaline, about every piece of evidence, every inconsistency in Vivienne's story, every reason I wanted to believe her over you. And I came to a conclusion, which is, I was wrong to walk into that room alone," he said. "I was wrong to let 3 years of history outweigh 3 days of proof. And I nearly cost you your life, because I needed longer than I should have to admit that the woman I loved has been lying to me since before I ever met her." Rosalind sat with that for a moment, her pulse slowly settling, the cold clarity of nearly dying giving way to something rawer. "I thought you'd chosen her," she admitted quietly. "I know," Dante said. "That's on me. I'm sorry." It was the first time she'd heard him say the words plainly, without qualification, and something in her chest loosened at the sound of it. "So what changed?" she asked. "What convinced you?" Dante reached into his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper, handing it to her without taking his eyes off the road. "My analyst finished tracing the burner phone an hour after you left. Full financial records. Vivienne's father isn't just connected to the Castellano family. He is the head of it, rebuilt under a new name, funding her placement in my life for over a decade. This wasn't opportunism. It was a plan they built before I ever knew she existed." Rosaline unfolded the paper, scanning the numbers, the dates, the careful architecture of a con 11 years in the making. "She really did fall in love with you at some point, didn't she? Somewhere in all this." "Does it matter?" "I think it matters to you," Rosaline said gently. "Even now." Dante was quiet for a long moment. the city lights sliding across his face. "It matters less than it did yesterday," he said finally. "Because whatever she felt for me once, it wasn't enough to stop her from planning to burn me and half this city down, to hand her father a throne. So what do we do with that? We stop being reactive," Dante said, something hardening in his voice, "and start being the ones setting the trap instead of walking into one." They spent the next 2 days building the case in full, moving between safe houses, piecing together a decade of careful manipulation with a speed that surprised even Dante's most seasoned analysts. The picture that emerged was worse than either of them had imagined. Vivian hadn't simply been planted to marry Dante and manufacture a war. She'd spent 11 years cultivating relationships across 3 rival families, feeding each of them just enough information to keep them suspicious of one another, positioning herself as the calm, reasonable voice each side trusted, while her father quietly rebuilt Castellano influence from the shadows. "She's not just marrying into power," Rosaline said, laying out the timeline across the safe house table at 2 in the morning, coffee gone cold beside her. "She's been the architect of half the tension between families for years." The wedding wasn't the beginning of the plan. It was supposed to be the final move. A war that eliminates every obstacle standing between her father and the entire underworld, Dante said grimly, "started in my name, funded by my resources, fought by my men. She'd have controlled New York without ever having to fire a single shot herself. And you'd have been the villain in every story told about it," Rosaline added quietly. "The grieving husband who burned 3 families to the ground, avenging a wife who was never actually in danger." Dante rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion and fury tangled together in the gesture. "I keep waiting to feel less like an idiot for not seeing it sooner." "You're not an idiot," Rosaline said. "You're a man who trusts the people he loves. That's not a flaw, Dante. It's just one she was very, very good at exploiting." He looked up at her, something raw and unguarded in his expression that had nothing to do with the case spread across the table between them. "You keep doing that." "Doing what?" "Making it easier to breathe," he said, quiet, almost surprised by his own admission. "I don't know how you manage it. Everyone else in my life either fears me or wants something from me. You just tell me the truth, over and over, even when it's the last thing I want to hear." "Somebody has to," Rosaline said, softer than her usual bite. "Might as well be the maid who ruined your wedding." Something almost like a real laugh escaped him. Brief, rusty, like a muscle he hadn't used in longer than he wanted to admit. "Best decision anyone's made in this house in years." The moment stretched between them, warmer than the exhaustion and the danger should have allowed, and Rosaline found herself very aware of exactly how close he was sitting, exactly how long it had been since anyone had looked at her the way Dante was looking at her now. Not through her, not past her, but directly at her, like she mattered. "We should focus," she said, breaking the moment before it went somewhere she wasn't ready to name. "Right," Dante agreed, though he didn't look away for another beat too long. "Focus." They turned back to the evidence, and slowly, methodically, a plan began to take shape between them. Not a plan built on violence or vengeance, but something sharper, something that would use Vivian's own weapon against her. "She wants a public moment," Rosalind said, tapping the timeline. "That's how she's always worked. The wedding, the poisoning, the framing, everything's been staged for an audience. If we're going to end this, it needs to happen the same way, publicly, where she can't twist the narrative afterward." Dante's eyes sharpened with something that looked, for the first time in days, like hope instead of grief. A second gathering, under the guise of resolving the scandal quietly, repairing the family's reputation. "She'll think she's regaining control," Rosaline said. "That's exactly what we want her to think. And when she's standing in front of everyone, certain she's won. We hand her the same proof that's been sitting on this table for the last 2 days, Rosaline finished, and let her explain 11 years of lies in front of every family she spent a decade manipulating." Dante looked at her for a long moment, something settling into his expression that felt, finally, like certainty instead of grief. "You're terrifying," he said, "in the best possible way." "I know," Rosaline said. "Try to keep up." The invitations went out under Dante's name alone, worded carefully to suggest exactly what Vivian would want to believe. A quiet resolution, a chance to clear her name in front of the families who'd begun to whisper, a graceful path back into the position she'd spent 11 years building toward. She arrived at the estate 3 days later, dressed like a woman certain of her victory. Ivory silk instead of a wedding gown. This time, her father's presence looming a few steps behind her, for the first time Rosaline had seen since this began. A broad, silver-haired man, with cold eyes, that gave away exactly where his daughter had learned to perform. Vivienne crossed the ballroom floor with practiced grace, hands outstretched, voice pitched for every ear in the room. "Thank you for this chance. I know how badly I've been made to look, and I only want the truth to finally come out." "So do I," Dante said, and something in his tone made her falter, just slightly, though she recovered fast enough that most of the room wouldn't have caught it. Rosaline stood near the back, dressed not as a maid this time but as a guest, watching Vivienne survey the room with the confidence of a woman who believed she'd already won. "I understand a maid in this house has been telling stories," Vivienne said, turning slowly, letting her eyes land on Rosaline with practiced disdain. "Stories designed, I can only assume, to draw attention to herself, or worse, to drive a wedge between myself and the man I love." "Careful," Dante said quietly. "That's the same story you told me a week ago. I've had time to check the details since then." Vivian's smile didn't waver, but something behind her eyes did. "What details?" Dante nodded, and one of his men wheeled forward a screen. The same encrypted messages Rosaline had read in the safe house, now displayed in full for every family present. Dosage calculations, coordination timestamps, the cold clinical language of a woman planning her own survivable poisoning. The ballroom went utterly silent. "That's fabricated," Vivian said, too fast, the first genuine crack in her composure. "Anyone can forge messages, Dante. You know that better than anyone in this business." "Cross-import and textiles," Rosaline said, stepping forward, voice carrying easily across the silent room. 11 years old. No history before that. Registered from an address that used to belong to a shell company in Chicago. Your father's real name is Castellano, isn't it? The family my father-in-law's father pushed out of Chicago 30 years ago. Vivian's father's expression didn't change, but the stillness in it was answer enough for the room. "You plan to poison yourself," Dante said, voice hard now, final. "A survivable dose, timed for the ceremony, designed to make it look like a rival family tried to kill you at our wedding. You were going to hand me a war, Vivian. Point me toward whichever family your father wanted eliminated, and let me burn my own resources destroying them, while your father claimed everything left standing." "You don't understand what it's like," Vivian said, and her voice had finally cracked. 3 years of performance collapsing into something raw and furious. "My father lost everything because of your family. 30 years of exile, watching everyone rebuild while we scraped by on nothing. I was 17 when he told me what I'd be, what I'd have to become to fix it." "That doesn't excuse what you did," Rosaline said, quieter now, almost gentle in the face of the woman's unraveling. "Whatever happened to your family, whatever you were raised to become, you chose this. Every step of it, you chose to almost start a war that would have killed hundreds of people who had nothing to do with what happened 30 years ago. I did love you," Vivian said, turning back to Dante, something desperate bleeding into her voice now. "That part was real, Dante. I swear it was real." "Maybe it was," Dante said, and there was no cruelty in his voice, only a weary, final kind of grief. "But it wasn't enough to stop you, and that's the only part that matters now." Sirens sounded somewhere beyond the estate gates, a call Dante had made an hour earlier, a decision Rosaline knew had cost him something to make, choosing the law over the older, bloodier justice his world usually demanded. "You're handing me to the police," Vivian said, disbelief cutting through the desperation. "Not your men, the authorities." "You wanted a war," Dante said. "I'm giving you a courtroom instead. Let the world see exactly what you and your father built, in daylight, where nobody can spin it into a story about a grieving husband's revenge." Vivian's father moved, fast, hands slipping toward his jacket, and Dante's men closed in before the motion finished, disarming him in seconds, the room erupting into the controlled chaos of federal agents finally moving through the doors. Dante had quietly let them through. The estate was quiet again by midnight, the last of the federal agents gone, Vivian and her father in custody, the whole elaborate architecture of an 11-year plan finally, publicly collapsed. Rosaline found Dante on the terrace, tie loosened, staring out at grounds that had hosted a wedding, an attempted assassination, and now something that felt, finally, like an ending. "You did the right thing," she said, joining him at the railing, "handing them to the police instead of your men." "I almost didn't," Dante admitted. "Every instinct I have wanted to handle this the way this world usually handles betrayal. But you didn't. Because of you," he said, turning to face her fully. "Every step of this, you were the one insisting on proof over vengeance, exposure over violence. I don't think I would have made it here without someone in my corner willing to argue with me every time I wanted to take the easier, uglier path." Rosaline felt something warm settle in her chest, unfamiliar after 3 years of being invisible in rooms exactly like this one. "For the record, I'm still furious you walked into that room alone with her. Duly noted. And that you doubted me, even for an hour." "Also noted," Dante said, something almost like a smile tugging at his mouth. "I'm prepared to spend a significant amount of time making up for both of those mistakes, if you'll let me. That's a big promise for a man who 3 days ago couldn't decide whether to trust me or arrest me." "I've had time to reconsider my priorities," Dante said, closing the distance between them slowly. The same deliberate care he'd shown her since the safe house, since the alley, since every moment he'd chosen her over easier, safer paths. "You saved my life at my own wedding. You were right about everything. Every single time. Even when believing you cost me something I wasn't ready to lose. I'd be a fool to let a woman like that walk out of my life because I was too proud to say so." "Careful, Mr. Moretti," Rosaline said, though her voice had gone soft, all the usual sharpness melting into something warmer. "That's dangerously close to a declaration." "Is it working?" "I'll let you know," she said. "Though I should warn you, if you ever get engaged again, I'm inspecting the cake personally. No exceptions." Dante laughed, really laughed, the sound rusty and unfamiliar and utterly genuine, the first time she'd heard it fully unguarded since she'd met him. "Deal," he said. "Though I should tell you, I'm not planning on needing that particular clause anytime soon." "No?" "No," Dante said, reaching up to tuck a loose curl behind her ear, his hand lingering there, warm against her skin. "I think I'd rather figure out what this is first. Slowly, properly. No poison, no politics, no 11-year plans. Just a maid and a mafia boss," Rosaline said, "figuring it out as they go." "Exactly that," Dante said, and when he kissed her, it wasn't the rushed, desperate collision of two people who'd survived something violent together. It was slow, deliberate, the first genuinely honest thing either of them had chosen in this house, that hadn't been forced by danger or death. Rosaline pulled back just far enough to look at him properly, something dry and warm flickering in her eyes. "For what it's worth," she said, "this is the best severance package I've ever gotten from a maid job." "You're fired, by the way," Dante said, "effective immediately." "I figured. I have other plans for you." "Careful," Rosaline said, smiling now, fully, freely, the kind of smile that had nothing left to guard against. That almost sounded like a proposal. "Give it time," Dante said, and pulled her back in. If you loved watching the maid outsmart a mafia queen and steal the boss's heart in the process, hit subscribe to Mr. Mafia Boss, because this is where the dangerous men live, the underestimated women win, and every story hits harder than the last. New sizzling mafia romance drops every week, packed with slow-burn tension, brutal betrayals, and endings you won't see coming. And before you go, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I might just give you a shout-out in the next story.